Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the Sony 24mm F1.4 G Master lens, a lens that a lot of you have been requesting that I do a review of for a while. And thanks to Sony Canada for getting me a loaner, and so that I can check it out and give you my verdict on it. Today's episode is brought to you by Nord Locker. I think at this stage, most of you are aware of the fact that there are a lot of people out on the internet that are trying to steal your personal data. Many of you probably are already familiar with or maybe already use a VPN like NordVPN. However, what Nord Locker does is take it to the next level of not just encrypting your browsing habits, but encrypting your personal files. And so whether it be documents that you just want to keep safe from prying eyes, or documents that you want to share in an encrypted fashion where you can control who sees them and who accesses them. Nord Locker gives you an easy way to do that with a drag and drop type functionality that will automatically encrypt files that you put into what they call lockers, which you then can either just keep encrypted and safe and under a master password, or you can also share them in an encrypted fashion where you can control who's actually has access to them. Now, if you will visit nordlocker.net/Dustin, you can get all of the details there. There is a free trial and even a free version if you just have limited amount of information you want to encrypt. However, right now, if you use the code Dustin, they have a special promotion to get Nord Locker for only about $1 a month. With the premium account, they offer you 24/7 tech support, multi-device access, master password recovery, and all of the various features that are going to make your life easier. So visit nordlocker.net/Dustin to check out and to get all of the details and to take the steps you need to secure your data from prying eyes on the internet. So as noted, a lot of you were very interested in my covering of the 24mm F1.4 G Master lens, and it's pretty easy to see why. Out of all the G Master lenses that I've reviewed to this point, I think that the 24mm is the most attractive package in a lot of ways. And that is for the simple reason that it is a compact lens, which in my experience is pretty rare with the G Master lens, but it combines a compact size that is safely well smaller than the Sigma 24mm F1.4, and on top of that, it also gives you a really competent optical and autofocus package. And so if you are more interested in just kind of the quick details and you don't want the nitty-gritty, stay tuned for at the end of the week. My standard review will be coming. Today, however, we're going to jump in detail, give you the details about the performance, the build, and particularly the image quality. So first of all, let's take a look at what you are getting here in terms of the build and the overall handling here. We're going to jump in and take a closer look at this very attractive package. The first thing that stands out about the 24mm GM is that this is a breath of fresh air when it comes to the size. Most of the G Master lenses that I have reviewed to this point have been amongst the largest in their class, and it is great to have a really moderately sized lens. And so just to give you an idea here of the size comparison, here's a comparison to the 50mm F1.4 planar lens. And so you can see that both in the physical size, but then also the heft, the GM lens is much smaller and lighter. Even compared, I don't have the 35mm F1.4 Sony Zeiss, but this Samyang 35mm F1.4 AF lens is fairly similar in size. And you can see also here that it is significantly larger. And so in terms of the overall weight here, it's 445 grams, or right under a pound of weight, 15.7 ounces. And so that's considerably lighter than, say, the Sigma 24mm F1.4, which is closer to the 700 gram range. And so, significantly heavier, more than 50% heavier. And then if you can compare to the newly announced 20mm F1.8, it is a little bit lighter at 373 grams, but it's also F1.8 versus F1.4. And so I think as far as the weight, they've found a nice balance between it still having a very nice build, and that build includes weather sealing and a gasket here. It does have fluorine coating on the front element. It also has internal seals, though I haven't been able to find a diagram that actually shows all the seal points. But you know, typically there's going to be 6 or 7 different seals inside there, typically at the switches, at the rings, you know, the traditional spots there. In terms of the overall diameter here, we have got a 2.97 inch or 75.4 millimeter diameter, which gives us a really common 67 millimeter filter thread. I'm glad to see that because it's one of the filter threads that I'm most heavily invested in because it is a common one that's shared with a lot of lenses. And so nice there. The overall length of the lens, 3.64 inches or 92.4 millimeters. And so overall, we've got a nicely compact lens, and so, you know, definitely like that. As far as the features go, the GM lenses have the hybrid approach to aperture, and so you have several different choices. You can either put it straight into an auto mode where it's controlled from within the camera. You can use the actual manual with detents at 1/3 click detents. You also have an option here of declicking it. And so as a video option, that's obviously nice because you can then smoothly rack through the aperture. Now, the aperture is electronically controlled. It's not a manual coupling here. And so you can see that even as I'm turning that, unlike a true manual focus lens, you're not going to see the aperture iris actually respond. Autofocus is still going to take place with the aperture wide open, and then it will close to whatever the selected value is. And so that's one video specific thing that is nice here. Another kind of video specific thing is that it is, of course, focused by wire, as mirrorless lenses are, but it is a linear focus motor, and so it allows you a little bit more precision, and the damping here is fairly good. The other nice aspect for video, which we'll explore a little bit more in a second, is that this has the DD-SSM motor, which is similar to what's in, say, the 200 to 600 millimeter G lens. And so, I mean, obviously that's great. It gives it a lot of focus speed, and there's a lot of torque there to drive it, and so it focuses quiet and quickly. Nice there. You do have a switch for AF, MF. Always glad to see that because it just gives you a more tactile physical control over that. And then there is a focus hold button that can be programmed to a variety of different functions. Another nice aspect of lens design here is that it actually has 11 rounded aperture blades and produces a surprisingly nice sunburst effect. And so I like that. Also, of course, the fact that 11 blades helps it to retain a more circular shape at smaller apertures. And so it means that, you know, while your bokeh at 24 millimeters is going to become more limited as you stop the lens down, what bokeh there will continue to have a nice circular shape. There are 13 elements in 10 groups in the optical design, and that does include several extreme spherical lens elements, XA elements, along with 3 extra low dispersion elements, ED elements. And so 5 of those elements are kind of the exotic, expensive ones that help to produce better performance. And so it's got nano coatings, all of the basic tech that Sony puts into its better lenses. And so as far as our build and design, there's a lot of great things here and a really fantastic form factor. And so I really like that. And so as you can see, I think one of the chief advantages here is that there isn't enough of a difference in the size and the weight of the G Master lens versus the smaller competitors that maybe have a smaller maximum aperture for this to really be a limiting factor at all. I don't think that anyone is going to be put off by this size and the weight of this lens. And so kudos to Sony for, you know, realizing what should be something basic, but that it seems like a lot of manufacturers don't get these days. And that is that people have real world considerations when it comes to how much size and weight that they either can bring along or are willing to deal with. And so I think that they've done a great job with that. They've also done a great job with the focus motor here that we have already mentioned previously, in that it is extremely fast, it's extremely quiet, and that's true whether you are working either in stills or in video work. And so let's take a closer look at that. First of all, let's take a look at the sound associated with making focus pulls. So as you can see, the focus pulls, they're smooth, they're quiet. The only thing that I noticed in just doing kind of standard work, just not for this in particular, but just doing video work, is that if I don't have anything else, I'm kind of in a completely silent environment and making focus changes, I can occasionally pick up on the onboard microphone a very, very faint but very high-pitched, just kind of whir noise that is there, that is taking place. But if there's any kind of environmental sound, or if you're recording audio in any other way, I don't think that it's really going to be a factor. And so overall, very, very good here. Now, when it comes to kind of the standard Sony focus things, be it IAF, be it phase tracking, or just kind of the general consensus focusing on objects that are close, I felt like all of those things it did fairly well. The only place that I saw any kind of hunting was actually at smaller apertures and mostly in backlit situations. And as you can see from this image, in what should have been a fairly easy shot, f5.6, but backlit landscape type scene, you can see that the lens didn't lock focus at all. And so here's what focus should have looked like in that instance. And so I only saw that on a couple of occasions. It's something that I've seen sometimes before on Sony. And so that's the only situation that I saw a shortcoming in, that sometimes it doesn't deal with backlighting the best. Now, that's kind of ironic because in many ways it deals with backlighting in terms of flare resistance quite well. So let's jump in and let's take a look at this point at the actual image quality performance, because I think that that's where a lot of you are really interested. First of all, let's take a quick look at distortion and vignette here. And so you can see that distortion is fairly mild. There is some vignette, but not an extreme amount. And here's a look at after correction. And so you can see as I toggle back and forth, it's mostly vignette that gets corrected here. You lose a little bit of the image just correcting for a little bit of distortion, but overall this is neither one of these things is extreme. So taking a quick look at f1.4 at our test chart here, and so we can see this is on an A7R Mark III, so 42 megapixels. You can see that center resolution is nice and crisp. Moving down to this zone, we can see it's still good here, and right off into the corner, you can see there's a little loss of contrast here towards the very edge, but overall I think that we have got quite a strong performance at f1.4. Taking it out into the real world at infinity, we can see middle of the frame, there is a good amount of resolution. You can see that there is just a hint of longitudinal chromatic aberration that is present here. And so that is taking off a little bit of contrast, but really that's a lot of resolution in the center of the frame. We can see that it's losing some towards the edge. But overall, I mean, we're fairly sharp here on this side, and it's also a little bit of a depth of field thing, but on the plane of focus, we can see at f1.4 that the edges are not as sharp as the center, as would be expected. Now here's another look at longitudinal chromatic aberrations. At this distance and in this particular scene, I think that they're very nicely controlled. Contrast looks good, and even here at along the edge, there's only the faintest bit of a little bit of lateral or longitudinal, a little bit of purple that's there. But overall, maybe a little bit of green there, but overall this is well controlled enough that I don't think it's going to be a real factor for anyone. Now we can compare f1.4 to f2. What we're going to find is that there is a fairly obvious uptick in our contrast in the center of the frame. You can just see that there's a little bit of a different look there, and that's true in the textures here. And as we move on down, we can see that everything just looks a little bit more delineated here towards the lower right corner. Now from f2 to f2.8, I don't see as noticeable a difference. Things look roughly the same. A little bit extra contrast here near the bottom, you can see from these lines, but overall we're more similar than different. Jumping back out to infinity, we find that the center of the frame looks really fantastic. Lots of detail, lots of contrast. I'm not really seeing any of those hints of chromatic aberration that I did before. We can also see as we look towards the edge here that the resolution is picking up towards the edge and looks pretty strong there. Now from f2.8 to f4, we see a little bit more brightness in the corners here, and so a little bit more of an uptick of contrast. And so as we look towards, kind of our landscape type usage, we're heading into a more optimal aperture here for that kind of performance. Going back to the infinity scene at f5.6, we can see that now things are looking really crisp everywhere that we look in the frame. And so, great landscape result here. Now shifting over here, this is actually on the A9, so not quite as high a resolution, but f5.6. So for a real world kind of landscape shot, obviously it looks really, really good. There's loss of contrast here. That's from falling snow in the area where we actually have a subject. No bleeding of textures. Everything is really crisp. Here's another example also on the A9. And again, a really kind of white out scene, but you can see that in the areas that should have contrast and detail, we have got lots of it, very nicely handled. Now, when it comes to flare resistance, we can see in just kind of a normal shot here that wide open with the sun very brightly here, it's caused a little bit of loss of contrast here in these kind of bare tree areas, but you see no obvious ghosting effect. If we take a look here with video panning across, you can see that at certain angles there are some ghosting artifacts, not out of control, however. Now stop down to f11, a couple of things stand out here. One of those is that you can see a pretty nice sunburst effect here. There are 11 aperture blades, and so you have a really high sun star count. So 22 blades coming off of that because it's an odd number. And so, but I think it looks pretty good, definitely useful. And in this case, contrast is held up really well. We also find with video panning that our flare resistance is actually better when stopped down. And the flare artifacts, there's really no veiling here. And even the ghosting is, I would say, a little bit better controlled. Now, while Sony touts this lens's ability to control coma, there's a little bit more to the story than that. Wide open, center of the frame looks pretty good here. You can see there's a little bit of fringing around some of the center point stars, but overall they look quite good. As we move off towards the edge, however, there's quite obvious coma at f1.4, and you can see, we've got a flock of birds that are flying out of the frame, and that is the result of the coma here. If you stop down to f1.8, you do eliminate some of the worst of it. And you can see that it's still there, but it's not as extreme. And even stopping on down to f2, you can see that, in the areas where it fails, it's still failing. And so I would say that if certainly use it if you buy the lens for shooting the night sky, but if you're buying a lens specifically for that purpose, there are better options out there, including the Sigma 14 to 24 millimeter f2.8 Art series lens, which definitely does a better job at f2.8 than even what this lens does. Now, fortunately, bokeh is actually a strength for the lens. And so we can see, even though this is as close to the top as we got, we can see that it's starting to deform a little bit, but overall the bokeh circles are really nice and round. And if we look at them, they are quite clean, not busy looking, and so a really nice result there. Stopping on down a little bit, we can see that the geometry straightens right out, and so you have nice near perfect circles at f2, f2.8. The advantage of a high aperture blade is being shown in that while you can start to see just the faintest bit of the blade, it's still really, really round. And even stop down even further here at f4, we can see we still have a really nicely circular shape. And so kudos to them, good job with that. Now, in terms of real world bokeh, obviously 24 millimeters is not going to obliterate backgrounds, but I think that our bokeh here is actually quite nice. And including if I put some things in the foreground, we can see that the delineation is really quite nice from this lens. Here's kind of another real world kind of result here. And so we can see that we have got nice detail on the corner of the building here, but other things are nicely blown out, even though the focal length is not long. Finally, the maximum magnification of 0.17 times is not class leading. In fact, it lags behind a number of competitors that I looked at. On a positive note, however, the actual performance is really high here. And you can see that it's really resolving the fine details here at minimum focus very, very nicely. And so, I think that there's pros and cons. It's the actual magnification isn't maybe as high at 0.17 times as what I would like, but the performance is very good at minimum focus. And so as you can see, I mostly have much more good than bad to report here. You know, as is fairly typical at wide apertures, you get better center sharpness than you do edge sharpness. And I found that to be most obvious when shooting landscapes. But to be fair, I don't really shoot landscapes at f1.4, rarely even at f2.8. And so by the time you get into the more typical landscape apertures, the lens is incredibly sharp from corner to corner. And I would say it's acceptably sharp even by, you know, f2 to f2.8. Just, you know, in shooting landscapes in those kind of big critical scenes, I did note a difference when I stopped down a bit more. However, there's plenty of sharpness there when shooting, you know, for typical subjects that you might want to shoot at a wide aperture. And so kudos to them for delivering a very competent optical performance in a, you know, a nice small and durable package. Now, as far as comparisons to other lenses, some of the other 24mm lenses that I've looked at on Sony include the new Tamron 24mm F2.8. Now, the GM obviously has advantages there in a 2-stop faster maximum aperture. It's also, you know, it's a better built, more feature-rich, obviously. The one thing that the Tamron has that the G Master doesn't is that great maximum magnification of 0.50, which is a far cry from what we see with the GM lens. Outside of that, however, I think that most people are going to find that the difference in performance is probably worth it, particularly when it comes to autofocus, if that's a critical thing for you. Now, if you just shoot primarily landscapes at smaller apertures, the Tamron's actually really sharp, and so it probably would serve your purposes fine. The G Master is the better lens by far if you're wanting to do portrait work, event work, things like that. Now, compared to the Sigma 24mm F1.4, which is the kind of the main competitor on Sony Space, in the case of the Sigma, the existing 24mm F1.4 art is one that was designed originally for DSLRs and then ported over to Sony E. As a result of that, you don't have as quality of focus. It's also larger than what it needs to be, frankly. And being one of the early art series lenses, it's actually not as good optically as what later art series lenses are. For me, the price difference, you know, there is a significant price difference. To me, I think if I were spending the money, I would pay the extra for the GM. It's a lens that's purpose designed for Sony. It takes, you know, full advantage of Sony autofocus capabilities. You know, it's a better physical match for Sony bodies. And it's optically better too. And so I think that if you're looking for a wide aperture 24mm lens, the G Master is probably the one to get. And at $1,399, while not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, it is actually the most reasonable of the various G Master lenses. And so that also makes it a kind of a no-brainer if you're looking for a premium lens in this space. And I do think that the difference, you know, when you consider all the different variables compared to the Sigma, are worth going for the G Master in this case. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you'll find linkage to my full text review. You can also find linkage to the image gallery, and so you can check out more photos. There's linkage there also if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, or to follow me on social media, to become a patron, sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.